still rough. All right, let me just adjust the mic a little bit here. All right. All right. How's everyone doing? How are we doing? Um, Look, so this is going to be a short one. I don't have any real. I don't have like graphics. I don't really even have a whole lot of tweets to pull up. What I do, what I do have, um, is a couple thoughts. I think most people are aware of the discourse that has dominated Twitter, much to my chagrin. And I'm guilty of participating in it as much as I don't want to. I'm a slave to the algorithm, same as everyone else. Um, but I think one of the things that people are missing here, there's a key piece that people are missing, I think it's imperative that a lot of the guys on our side that are viewing some of this discourse and seeing the disconnect between what the argument actually is about the prudence of picking a spouse and what factors go into that decision versus this talk about are people saved and like is repentance valid, wading off into the weeds. I think that's part of a Jesus juke, and I think we need to start viewing this as a part of a normalization cycle. And I'd like to kind of get into what that means. So I don't expect this to be long. Just jumping in. And like I said, I apologize. I don't have really anything prepared here, so I'm just kind of gonna go off the cuff. Um, where is? Oh man, there it is. Okay, so my keys are working. Sweet. Man, some of my animations are not even working. All right. Anyway, so we have this story, and let me see the original story of all of this. Was the guy Trevor? He posted this long screed about his wife, Trevor Sheets. A nebbish kind of looking character. I don't think he's all that impressive. Interesting little tidbit, I guess, is that he runs a social media company that promises like 30x growth on engagement. So, if this is his resume, he's certainly done that. Not exactly the way I would go about promoting my business, but it all starts with Tom Buck, and Tom Buck happens to hop on discourse that has been rehashed from the I think it was October of last year, in which Protestia was viewing the Nala Ray conversion story, and fawning over Nala Ray. And at the time, guys like me were saying, look, it is not prudent for a sexually unexperienced man to go into marriage with a very sexually experienced woman uh, without proper considerations. And there's reasons for this, right? We're not just saying it because like it's some manosphere talking point, like, oh, what's your body count? It's not about that. It's about the fact that a husband and a wife coming together as one flesh are already going to have myriad obstacles in their marriage, right? They're already going to be facing difficulties. Just coming together, living under one roof, blending finances, trying to figure out how to make life work, working towards starting a family, having kids, all the heartbreak and the joys and pains and things that come with that. And then you're going to throw into this mix a imbalance. And especially if the woman is more experienced than the man, you're going to have an imbalance where he is plagued by the notion that she is comparing him to others, or he is plagued by the notion that she is unhappy, or that there's someone in her past that made her, happier, more sexually satisfied. Uh, well, did she do this with that other guy? Did she react like this when the other guy was doing this? And those are significant obstacles. And pastors, because they conflate real world with spiritual things constantly, and make proclamations on things that they don't understand because they took a biblical counseling course at Liberty University or something. They 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 have no frame of mind to really sit down and separate the pragmatics of people coming together in marriage. It's all pseudo psychological pop psych nonsense with a veneer of Christianese. And so this is the frame in which Tom Buck is entering. He says, if someone argues that a former promiscuous woman is damaged goods and questions whether a Christian young man should marry her, remember Rahab. She was a Canaanite prostitute, but became a mother in the lineage of Jesus. God redeemed her and cleansed her, and Salmon married her. This is true, right? It's historically accurate. God used pretty terrible people in the course of the history of the Hebrews. And there was a lot of terrible people in their history. And God worked it out for his plan, right? It was his divine plan all along. The question remains, though, is this an exception to the rule, or is this normative? Is it good for us to encourage behavior that would pair bond, virginal young men, I don't like virgin for guys, it's kind of weird, sexually inexperienced young men with prostitutes? Is that normative, and is that good? Is that something that we should be promoting? I think the argument is no. And so Trevor enters, and again, this goes back to the Nala discussion, but even Protestia posted a video of Nala on a podcast, because that's what reformed porn stars do, is they get a new grift where they're still on camera just with clothes on. And now instead of their tits, it's their opinions we're supposed to value and, pay attention to. Of course, the tits are out. They're just covered in tight clothing, but pay no attention to that. It's really her thoughts and her testimony that are really important. That's why they're continuing to do a show. So Nala, one of the videos that Protestia posted was Nala's husband engaging with the idea of how difficult it has been to not think about all the guys that came before him in their marriage bed, and how intimacy is a struggle. And it's like, yes, this justifies all of the arguments. This is an example of everything that we were saying when we were having the Nala reformed Hoe discourse. So now we're rehashing it. And so Trevor comes in. I'm not going to read the whole Trevor post, but the dude, you could not, no, none of you people are ever going to know about me and my wife's relationship sexually, or anything about my wife. You couldn't torture this out of me. Not that my wife has all skeletons in her closet or anything, but this is just, it's over the top. And, the internet rightly reacted to it. Sorry, a little sip of the silly. And the internet rightly reacted to it. And the dichotomy between the reaction of normal guys and the evangelical women was pretty stark. You have, just looking through the quote tweets, there's 7.1 thousand quote tweets. Holy moly. You saw a mix of people's reactions, and most of the guys that I follow what the hell are you talking about, dude? You're saying she was radically born again, committed to the church, evangelicalized, grief over past sexuality. We got to know each other well. He goes on to talk about later how she was a cam girl. And, there's videos of her doing Instagram streams where she's talking about how she doesn't even remember how many guys she slept with. So he's doing an online influencer thing. She's doing an online influencer thing. And the content is effectively their relationship, right? They're promoting their relationship. She's promoting how much of a promiscuous person she was in the past, and he's promoting how tolerant he is of that fact because God has worked it out. And for what it's worth, that's great. I don't besmirch them really at all. Everyone makes their own decisions, and if this is the situation that God put you in, if this is where you are now, great. But again, it comes back to Rahab. Is this example normative? should we look at something like this and say, this is great, this is good, this is how society should function? And now Trevor has gone on podcast appearances. He's being mentioned on The Daily Wire with Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles and Ben Shapiro. He went on another podcast here. What is it? Which one? Oh, Ray Comfort. He went on. Did an interview with them. His wife did an interview with Allie Beth Stuckey today. As if you needed another reason to not send your wives to her stupid conferences. So the point is that they've used this revealing of their intimate details of her past indiscretions and his tolerance of those indiscretions as a married couple, and leverage that into a social media publicity campaign under the guise of it being a testimony. Now, whatever you think of testimonies and public professions, I'm not the biggest fan, but also I'm pretty anti-evangelical at this point. I understand, especially within the confines of a church, like if you're making a public profession prior to a baptism, a believer's baptism, like that's fine. And to be fair, like this is probably a story that would be edifying to the local church. People that know you, people to whom you're accountable in your own community. You say, look, this is who we were, and we are not that person anymore. And God is doing a work in us. This is our testimony to you about who God is making us into. And you as our community, we're bringing you into this fact about our lives so that you can hold us accountable and you can support us. It's certainly not for public consumption. And so I think part of the reason that people latched on to the pro-Trevor saga, the pro-public testimony, and then started conflating any criticism of the delivery mechanism and the prudence of the application of that story. So if you said, like, Trevor, this is not an appropriate thing to talk about your wife in public, like on a massive platform, or Trevor, I don't think this situation between you and your wife is or should be normal for most people. I think people should probably prioritize being married to individuals with similar sexual experiences. If you had those two criticisms, other people came in and said you were minimizing grace, or you had no conception of grace, or even you aren't saved. People were saying that I'm not a Christian because I can't conceive of redemption or grace and how it works. It's like, yeah, I can. I'm not the greatest person in the world. I've done some things, guys. And God has done a work in me and, convicted me of those sins. And I have repented of those sins in many ways. And I'm still working through the sanctification process of those sins. But what I'm not doing is saying that, like, hey, this is a great idea. You should have your prodigal son arc. Every Christian young man, every Christian young woman should have a hoe phase where you're going out and you're doing foolish things so that grace might increase and abound all the more. I think Paul talks about that, actually. And so I think a part of the reason people latched onto this on the content side, these big creators like Sola Chad and Protestia, is I think there's a grief deep down in some people that requires them to view redemption as a staccato, immediate process in which all of for practical purposes, their sins are completely erased and the consequences of those sins are erased. Not just for like a soteriological effect. It's not just about salvation. It is these people want to live in a world where they didn't do what they did. And they manufacture a situation in which, like, there are no temporal consequences. God has fixed my problem. And that's, look, I mean, I think it's partially true, right? Like the whole point of metanoia, you're a new man, you're a new woman. After you repent and you come to Christ, the Holy Spirit indwells in you and gives you the ability to be a new person. So I think there is like something true to that, that like from that point on, you're working through the process of sanctification. You're working with the Holy Spirit now to live up to a Christian ethic. You're living according to the law and the gospel. But it doesn't erase the temporal consequences. The gospel doesn't regrow arms. The gospel doesn't cure herpes. The gospel, doesn't unabort the babies. Right? And so I think there's people that live with guilt and wish they could go back in time and undo the things they did. And so they have to promote this idea that there is this like actual semi-magical temporal thing that happens in which like the sins are forgiven, but also the consequences are assuaged. So in that light, they're working as part of, unwittingly probably, I don't think people are being malicious about this. I think they're genuinely foolish, but they're unwittingly participating in what I call a normalization loop. Another sip of the silly to coat the throat. Keep that voice crisp. What do I mean by a normalization loop? So think of homosexuality in America. At the end of the 80s, the AIDS crisis was in full swing. Freddie Mercury was dying. Homosexuals were dying all over the place of AIDS. People were scared. There was a big public fear about AIDS. And then in the early 90s, we had Live Aid, right? We're going to solve AIDS and we're going to destigmatize AIDS. And in the corners of our culture, in the artsy urban cultures, were these homosexual enclaves. And they were, a range of pits of incredible debauchery and disgusting behavior, mixed in with like some relatively normal gays, I guess. And so these people were creative types. They worked in media, they worked in copy editing, they were writers, they were cameramen, they were graphic designers, and they were in these creative industries, and they had access and networks to promote their worldview on a big stage. And so you had shows that would come out like Will and Grace or Roseanne, where there was a gay character that was like, it was just a side thing. It wasn't really the main thing. And then Will and Grace, it was obviously more center stage. But the character, the homosexuality of the character was not really a trait. It was like a piece of trivia, right? Oh, it's just a normal guy. It's just the normal guy. He's gay, but he's normal. Like he's completely no different than you. And what that serves to do is like to create an anchor of social acceptance and push that needle a little bit. You're exposed to it. Everything you've been exposed to in terms of homosexuality thus far has been horrifying, right? But this guy's normal. This guy on the TV is normal, and you already have from your, people used to watch TV. It was appointment TV. You had to have the TV on at the right time to catch the show, and so people had these parasocial relationships with these characters. And so you're psychologically kind of a member of this family on the TV. And then when the character's like, hey, I'm gay, it's like everyone laughs. The laugh track happens. You're emotionally engaged with that piece of trivia. None of the characters are reacting with them recoiling in horror like an anaconda. No, they're handling it the way the writers want you to handle it, Or if like a character reveals he's gay and is subject to bigotry, the writers are going to make sure that that the bigot is going to get its comeuppance, or there's going to be some emotional story in which like, the bigot is saved by the homosexual man who donates blood or something, and the bigot eventually repents and everyone's friends because it's just a normal homosexual guy. And I think this loop exists, continuously. Will and Grace created effectively in a top level acceptance, more or less. It started with like the art crews and worked its way down through like elite figures. Homosexuality has always kind of been like a little pastiche of eliteness. There's kind of the classic archetype of the poofta that lives amongst the rich. Never marries, but he's always patroned by wealthy people and kept around as a sort of oddity. And so you had this top-down thing where by the time Prop 13 rolled around in California, people voted overwhelmingly to say, like, no, we're not legalizing homosexual marriage. And it took an activist judge to say, like, well, actually you are. And so the culture was pushed from the arts and the cult and what people were watching on TV. It was reinforced through elite fiat, and then that gave people the space to internalize the fact that the culture was shifting, and it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. There was a culture of silence where, if you made fun of anyone or dissented from the prevailing view on the acceptance of homosexuals into polite society, whether it was marriage or adoption or being in a parade where they're, sodomizing each other on a parade float or doing all manner of terrible, terrible things to each other in public. If you dissented from that, you were the bigot on Roseanne. You were going to get your comeuppance. Karma was against you. And it becomes a reinforcing cycle. And this is part of the normalization cascade. So this is one of probably the more well-written phenomenon in sociology. Emile Durkheim, Peter Berger, Thomas Luckham. There's different ways to approach this, and we're just kind of going to give you a brief overview. But the core ideas to Durkheim is norms move through stages where there's externalization. People introduce new ideas, new behaviors. It's kind of out on the periphery. And then there's objectivation, where these behaviors become more socially recognized. Like people look at something that's happening, abortion. It's like, well, that's a thing we have to deal with. It becomes inside of people's context frames in their daily life. And then internalization. They absorb behaviors as natural, even substituting their traditions for an updated moral truth about that, about whatever it is. And this is from the social construction of reality. But it starts with the controversial becomes familiar, then expected, and then invisible. So what's out there on the fringe gets put in people's faces, and then through exposure, it becomes expected. And then once people begin to expect it in their daily lives, then they cease to care about it as much. It becomes invisible to them. Joseph Overton talks about this as well. His was more political. That's why we call it the Overton window, the political normalization of ideas. But his framework was, the window begins to shift because the unthinkable moves into the radical, which moves into the acceptable, then the sensible, then popular, and then it becomes policy. I disagree a little bit with Joseph insofar as I think elite theory is more of a thing. There's not really evidence. I don't think that there's ever really organic ground up grassroots diffusion and pushing of culture. It almost always comes from elite circles or some sort of executive fiat through one way or another. But we've seen it online with mimetic activity. While that hasn't really translated, the GOP is 10, 15 years behind what most right-wingers are politically. And it's because I think mimetics moves more similar to Overton, but the actual politics of it is much more top-down. But there's Everett Rogers talks about the diffusion of innovations, which is more about technology, but it also can apply to culture. You have the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and then the laggards. And you saw this with the iPhone, right? There was the first iterations of the iPhone. These innovators and early adopters were talking about this brand new tech. It's like, I have my BlackBerry. Why do I need an iPhone? And then eventually, the idea of a touchscreen smartphone becomes so ubiquitous that if you still had a BlackBerry in 2010, you were kind of lame. But there's also norm cascade theory, in which, and this is, I think, Martha Finnemore and Catherine Sickink. But norms emerge. There's norm emergence through activism. They call them norm entrepreneurs. And then there's a cascade through rapid adoption via pressure and limitation, and then norm internalization. And it harkens back to a similar model to Durkheim. But again, the idea is that there's something that exists on the fringe. You are confronted with it, and as the encounters become more and more frequent, you begin to lose. Um, you begin to accept that it exists in some capacity. Um, One of the things that the uh, I, Elizabeth Noel Newman, sorry, I'm going off of some notes. Elizabeth Noel Newman writes about the spiral of silence. And I think the application is usually used towards more feminist ends. But it appears in the culture that there are self reinforcing mechanisms, whereas like a perceived consensus accelerates normalization. So opposition to the consensus or the perceived consensus disappears from public view because people begin to self censor, and as that self censorship ramps up. More and more people will self censor because the consensus has the appearance of being more unanimous. And nobody wants to be the guy, the one man out. Um, you know, Michel Foucault obviously talked about normalization in a more technical sense. Um, his was more institutional, where repeated classification, measurement, and correction eventually produces self-policing individuals. It's not really about adoption of new ideas, but his was more about enforcement and control as a postmodern critique. About breaking these enforcement mechanisms. Gramsci, talked about cultural hegemony, normalization, Zajunk, uh, mere exposure effect, where repeated exposure led to increased acceptance, which led to reduced emotional resistance. And this explains like the mechanism behind normalization. What shocks you today becomes background noise tomorrow. And how true is that on Twitter? The more stuff we see like every day, it's just the the content cycle is 30 seconds long now on X and on podcasts and everything. It's just, what are we talking about today? Well, everything moves so quickly. So, I think if we were going to go through kind of pulling from a bunch of different sources, uh, I would say that there's the cycle is this introduction, where these these things exist on the fringe and they start to matriculate into broader society through controlled exposure. And through that exposure, there's legitimation, intellectuals, art people, people who hold levers of the culture and academia, and professional guilds, like high-end attorneys, politicians, bankers. They provide intellectual legitimacy to these new norms. And from the elites, it diffuses through social networks, not digital necessarily, but through as like a societal, a social contagion, a mimetic. It diffuses through society in general. There's imitation. It becomes fashionable. There's pressure to conform or to be cutting edge, and so it allows for the quick capillary diffusion of new norming mimetics. And then once it's diffuse across the society, every part of the culture is now interacting with it in some degree. And that's the loss of stigma, the normalization process, where it becomes so common that, and so cool to some extent, that the protestations of the more rigid fall on deaf ears, and it becomes normalized. Internalization, once it's relatively normal to do something or to be something, it gives people broad leeway and excuse to begin to internalize them and adopt it into their own personal identity. And then enforcement is the last one, and it becomes formally or informally enforced through social incentives, or even policy, to the point now where we used to play a game called Smear the Thing, and I don't think you can play that anymore without getting into some serious trouble. So it became socially enforced that you were not allowed to use any sort of derogatory language against this protected class, whether it's homosexuals or some other identity. Or you're not allowed to pray outside of abortion clinics because people getting abortions might feel bad, and that's like an enforcement of the abortive norm. And so, how does that relate to Trevor and his wife? I don't want to rag on these people. I'm more concerned about the environment that allows Trevor and his wife to get engagement numbers like this. Like, what was his? He's 155,000 views, 150,000 views, 12,000, 54,000, 225,000. And then on his big one, 35 million. 35 million. 35 million people have read or at least seen this post about his wife was promiscuous and he was a virgin. So what is the normalizing cycle for this? Well, it seems to me that part of the normalizing cycle is to put examples like this in your face. And then what pastors and Christian content creators and Sola Chads and all these influencers, what they're doing is they're saying this is normative. This is what you should be. This is ideal. There was talk about the reformed prostitutes being more pure than virgins, more, they're obviously better marriage material. And why? We can look at this example. Trevor's become an exemplar for the pastoral solution to the incel problem. And maybe there's like an incentive behind that that's a little more nefarious. Like, well, the incels are probably going to be a little more easy to control if they have a strong reformed prostitute wife, evangelical wife behind them. I don't know. But they're picking this example up. They're showing it into your face. So you have cultural exposure. There's already a significant amount of women that have had OnlyFans, that or participated in pornography in some way, or have been relatively promiscuous. And these are mostly millennial women. I mean, the stats are in, like, most young people these days are not having copious amounts of sex. But so we have these women that are aging out of opportunity, let's say, in the adult arena. And where are they going? Well, they're going, the off ramp seems to be the trad wife grift now. You can make a lot of money, or you can get a lot of eyeballs by shutting down the OF and starting a podcast where you constantly talk about OF, but you're doing it with a tight shirt and a nice long skirt. Your hair's up in a 1950s ponytail, and you're just so peppy and on fire for talking about Jesus things, not necessarily like bad theology and what you're making your husband for dinner. It's a grift, and so there's a need. We have this social incentive. There's a glut of these women that are coming into churches. Pastors are encountering them. Pastors are trying to pastor them. Pastors are weak and effeminate and effete in most cases. And so their idea is that, hey, redemption is redemption. Redemption covers all. It's like, yeah, that's true from a sociological or from a soteriological standpoint. Like, yeah, like if we're talking about the imputed righteousness of Christ, yeah, thank God, because I'm a terrible person. I'm a sinner, and so are you. And if it wasn't for the imputed righteousness of Christ, we'd all be damned. That said, is it prudent? Should this be normalized? Should this be put out as an exemplar? And I think part of the reason that it's being done that way is because there's social incentive to do so. This is another flex, another evangelical kind of way to I don't know, I guess virtue signal for clout. But it's definitely part of the normalization cycle. We're at the exposure. People are obviously like reviled by this, as like shown by the reaction. Lily Phillip is another one of these prostitutes. Obviously, probably to a much larger scale than anyone else that we've talked about here. But she famously like set a world record for the amount of people that she banged in a day or something. And she got baptized, and it's like, okay, I'm proud of you. Like I'm genuinely happy. But does that mean like we should tee up the next virgin guy for you to marry and get hitched and set you up for life because you said you said some words? So I don't know. It seems like there's a lot of guilty consciences out there, and a lot of people that want there to be a normalization of like, here's the most disgusting stuff. But God can save them, and He can save you too. It's like, yeah, but like, what are we doing for the people that are like in the church? What are we doing for the people that have been faithful? How are we helping young people pair bond? How are we like getting people hitched? What's your plan for that? Or is the plan just to like virtue signal about one-off examples and people that like have real messed up backstories? I mean, I think these testimonies are great within the confines of the church. It's important to recognize the work that God does in our lives. It's important to be grateful, but it definitely shouldn't be normal that we're expecting guys that have been looked over for ages, guys that probably need to get some stuff about themselves figured out, but they're being looked over for petty reasons. And then the girls come back in their mid 30s after their hoe phase, and it's like, well, she's redeemed now and she's ready for you. I don't think that's the message we want to be sending. In fact, I think we should probably create a society where the incentives are stacked in a way in which the women and the men are both enticed to chastity and to prudence and to wisdom, and not provided an off ramp that's always going to be there, when it says like, let us increase sinning so grace might abound the more. Like I said, I think Paul talks about that. So what do we do with this? Well, my advice to guys is one, like, this is a direct affront to, I think, the witness of the church, and I think the people's reactions, especially outside, non-Christians, pagans, the agnostic types, they're viewing this with disdain, as they probably should. This is what you're going to get if you become an evangelical Christian. The best you can do is hoe wife. Not the best witness. I think we should probably put on a better face than that for the world. We should continue to love each other and support each other and work in our local communities and churches to ensure that there is pipelines for matrimony amongst young virginal people, so they are not enticed to sin. For the guys out there, my dating advice is pretty simple. It's become interesting. Find something you like about yourself and dive into that. Become interesting. Get in proximity with women that you find interesting, and then be assertive. Do not ask. Do not use question marks. Just be assertive. Tell them what you want, and keep going. For the women, don't accuse everybody of being a porn addict just because they find valid criticisms of you. What else did I have? And then for marriage, I put out a priority list. My priority list is pretty simple. It's straightforward. In order of prudence, are you guys both Christians? That's obviously the most paramount thing. Some pastors are saying, well, if she's a Christian, she's fine. It's like, yeah, that is the most important thing. Yes, you should not be unequally yoked. Yes, you should both be Christians. It might be the most important thing, but it is not the only important thing. For me, the second one is parents are not divorced. If you're coming from a situation where your parents are together, you should look for a girl or a guy whose parents are together. It's hard. It's a hard one, especially today. My wife's parents were not divorced. My parents are not divorced. Divorce is not an option. It's not within our vocabulary, and it's a great starting point for a marriage. If you don't have that, I would supplement this with both have people that are mentors that are married and have been married for a long time. And if you don't have married couple friends that would be willing to mentor you or talk to you about that kind of stuff, you need to find them. And if your church doesn't have people like that are willing to counsel you or be your friend and help you out, you need to go to a new church. I'm serious. Like you need older people in your life that are married that are going to be able to help you through relationships and or the early years of marriage. Same race. I think it's important, not just for aesthetics, but for culture. I think disparate cultural experiences, different family expectations, it creates a lot of friction and a lot of identity problems for the family that comes after. Same sexual experience. Again, we talked about the reasons why. I think if there's disparate sexual experience, there's a lot of heartbreak you have to wade through, and frankly, a lot of baggage and a lot of guilt, and a lot of nonsense, man. And if you're not experienced sexually as a guy, you're trying to lead your wife through all this with, while maintaining your own sanity and your own integrity and your own understanding of things, it's hard. Same understanding of spousal roles. This is number 5. you should be on the same page about what the house is going to be. And that's not, it doesn't mean to say she has to agree with all your political opinions or denominational opinions. My wife is not not reformed, not even Calvinist when we met, and not all that much patriarchal. But I was able to lead her into those positions because I I led the household in love, and she expected me to be the man of the house, and I was. Your success might vary, and then everything else. So that's it for me, man. I'll check in, see if there's anyone chatting. No, but hey, I want you guys to know it's been real. I appreciate you letting me get this off my chest, and I will see you next time. Bye.